Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Once again, as we welcome you to the second half of this evening's edition of In Conversation with myself, Inayat Wadi, and once again, highlighting the plight of a nation where no other nation has suffered in totality in each and every aspect of their lives. And we've seen over 7 decades how this has been accompanied by brutality, by humiliation, by degradation, deprivation, injustice. And this is a nation where every right has actually been taken away from. And we've seen it over 70 years, where we've seen their right to education, their right to medical care, their right, restrictions on freedom of movement, the demolitions of their home, water, electricity deprivation, crop destruction, you name it, economic strangulation, all of it. And this is why we talk about the oceans of injustice. And this has been the story of the people of Palestine. This has been the story of the people of Gaza. And it has been their story for over 2 decades. And what we're seeing is even worse, as now we are seeing starvation in the worst form. And this is one of the most undignified and barbaric ways to kill somebody, because starvation is done by one person to the other. And we know the intention is clear, to maximize the suffering of the people of Palestine. Now, many of us have seen visuals. We see it on our phones daily, on a daily basis, on social media. We see human skeletons. We see how people are starving. We see those pots, the banging of pots. We see children being reduced to beggars. But mentally and medically, do we truly realize, truly appreciate what it is doing to those bodies, men, women, children, babies? And this is the reason why we are talking about the medical and the mental consequences of starvation in Gaza. We've got with us Dr. Yumna Minty, who is a psychiatrist with a special interest in women's mental health, and also a part-time lecturer and research supervisor at the University of Witwatersrand School of Clinical Medicine. We've got Ayesha Madaran, a UKZN qualified dietitian from Pietermaritzburg, passionate about all things nutrition, and also an advocate for the struggle of humanity. Deeply rooted is her empathy for the Palestinian cause. And also with us, a pediatrician, Dr. Ahmed Ismail Manjra, and he has got a master's degree in clinical pharmacology, and also a diploma. But also, what is important to note is he visited Gaza in 2012. To all of you, Dr. Yumna, Aisha, and Dr. Ahmed Manjra, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome. Jazakallah khairan so much for your time.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Dr. Ahmed, I think, now that you mentioned to me that you visited Gaza in 2012, and the picture that I had painted in my introduction, the oceans of injustice, and trying to reconcile with what is actually and truly happening in Gaza. And I'm sure when you see the images now compared to what you've seen in 2012, it tells a completely different story and paints a completely different picture.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that in 2012, we were given the opportunity to go to Gaza, to the Rafah border, and we spent about 10 days or slightly more, visiting Gaza as an act of solidarity with the people of Gaza. Now, we must not forget that this siege of Gaza began long ago. It's almost more than 20 years now. And what we saw and what we know is that the children of Gaza were already compromised in terms of the nutrition. So they had chronic malnutrition. And the effect of the war since the 7th of October 2023 has now added injury to the already compromised nutrition that they had. So now they've got acute on chronic malnutrition. Gaza has been under siege for a very long time now. As I've mentioned, it's almost more than 2 decades. And everything that enters Gaza is through the control of the occupying Zionist forces. There's a land, a sea, and an air siege. And everything that enters, food included, is controlled by the Zionist regime. And we know that very limited amounts of food were allowed, not only now, but for the last 25 years or so, since Gaza has been under siege. We also know that water has been a problem, and access to medicines and life-saving drugs has also been a problem. We were fortunate to have visited many of the health facilities at that time, clinics as well as hospitals. And one of the hospitals we visited was the Al-Shifa Hospital, which we know has been completely devastated by this war. And most of the healthcare facilities, in fact, all of them, have been completely made dysfunctional, and people do not have access to any health needs that they have. So what we're seeing here is children already compromised. They had chronic levels of malnutrition, and superimposed on that, we now find an acute form of malnutrition. And these, has devastating consequences, not only now, but in a long term as well, which we can talk about later in this program.
Now, inshallah, we certainly will be talking about that. And let's bring Dr. Yumna Minty into the discussion. Now, Dr. Yumna, we're talking about over 70 years of occupation, and we're talking about generational trauma. And for someone like yourself as a psychiatrist, and I recall last year when we had the journalist from Al Jazeera that was here, Yumna Al Said, and I asked Yumna one question in terms of what she witnessed as a journalist, forget being a victim. And we were on the plane to Botswana, and I asked Yumna, I said, how do you sleep at night? And she mentioned to me, she says, I don't sleep. She says, a part of my brain is awake and a part of my brain is asleep. Now, this is someone who's just witnessed it firsthand. One can just imagine what psychologically, mentally, what the victims are actually going through.
Jazakallah for that, and assalamu alaikum to your listeners. So, yes, I agree. We may be talking about starvation, which is the sort of acute thing that we know is happening in Gaza at the moment. But if we have to kind of set the scene to what we're seeing at the moment, it is, as Dr. Manjra said, 20 years worth of a siege of Gaza, and then 2 years of this intense conflict and this war that is being waged on the people of Gaza and the destruction that's happening. So aside from just the starvation that we're seeing, we have to recognize the other traumas that have been going on. So the displacement, people in Gaza are surrounded by death on a daily basis. There are injuries, there is torture, psychological and physical. There has been a complete disruption of their way of life, of their structures, their facilities, their infrastructure. And all of this is in the context of these deliberate acts that have been going on. Like I said, we can talk about starvation, but I think that implies that, there's a shortage of food, and people don't have enough food, and they're not getting enough nutrition. But in this instance, it's not just a starvation, it is a deliberate starvation. Food is being deliberately withheld from people in Gaza. Their needs, their very basic needs for survival, are not being met. And I think on the one hand, yes, we can concern ourselves with, the cognitive and the mental effects of starvation. But then there's also the other side of it, the fact that all of this is deliberate and that these acts are meant to dehumanize and degrade an entire population. And we can talk about the psychological effects that come from that as well. And like you mentioned, it's been years and years and years worth of trauma on top of the next. We have terms in psychology and psychiatry to talk about things like trauma, so, PTSD or post-traumatic stress. But I look at visuals and I read things in the newspaper and I think to myself, I don't think we have a word or a description or context to accurately describe what people in Gaza are going through at the moment. I don't think that anything we have encompasses or encapsulates the kind of suffering that is going on in Gaza at the moment.
Yes, and in fact, what I'd also like to do is, I think you touch on a very, very important aspect, and also just to look at, whether psychologists, whether psychiatrists, whether people that would treat PTSD, would be able to even cope under the circumstances, or does this actually give new meaning to trauma? It's taken trauma to a different level. And I think I'd like you to comment on that a bit later as well. But before that, let's just talk about with Ayesha as well. Because, again, Ayesha, as a dietitian, and you know very well what food actually means for the body. And with this brutal, this undignified, this barbaric way of starving people, and again, looking at the limited or no access to food and water in terms of their bodies, and how their bodies may be flipping in survival mode.
Yes, exactly that. Absolutely. I think that it's so important to realize, as Dr. Yumna had stated, that there isn't even the hope of food reaching them at certain points that we've seen online. And these people don't even have the ability to think about, like, where is the next meal coming from? And imagine being in a starving state, not being able to have enough energy to care for yourself, let alone your family, your children around you. So for us, if we could empathize on any level, it would be like, imagine that you are having your first fast in Ramadan, and you've had seri, but now the hours are ticking, and you start to feel hunger in your stomach, which means that your body has digested whatever food is in there. And then after all the glucose has been used up, your body turns to your protein, your muscle, and your fat stores to energize itself. In the case of these people who haven't been eating or drinking regularly, and have had no sources of essential vitamins and minerals, and even the aid that has been coming through have been poisoned with drugs. They're even afraid to go and look for food or go to the sources of aid because of the fear of being shot at. How do we even encompass what they're going through? How do we, it goes, as you said, beyond the point of imagination. But their bodies would then begin to shut down. So the systems, having not been fed over a long period of time, multi-organ failure begin to set in. Kidney failure, liver failure, because of dehydration over a long period of time as well. Essential vitamins and minerals not having been fed into the body, causing cognitive delays in children, and the inability to grow at the pace at which would be ideal for them. Especially for the children, the babies, in the first 1,000 days of life in particular, at that time is very crucial for them to meet certain nutritional needs. And in this case, we have seen that they not even meeting a quarter of what they may need. And the aid is actually not even able to get to them. So I can't imagine what the parents of these children must be experiencing at this point, themselves being in a starving state and not having the ability to care for themselves. That also being said, this is the perfect time to have this discussion because it's World Breastfeeding Week. So thinking about the breastfeeding mothers as well, and the fact that their nutritional needs are much higher, the pregnant and breastfeeding mothers, for that matter, their nutritional needs are much higher, caring for both themselves and their children. So them even worrying about Would the baby be able to? Would they be able to carry the baby to term? Would they be able to provide for this child in the form of nutrition getting through the placenta, or them being able to breastfeed them? It's a lot.
Well, it certainly is. I see Dr. Ahmed, I think, has disappeared off screen. Possibly he may have lost connection, but we will continue. Hopefully, he will continue joining us. Dr. Yumna, I think just as a follow-up question, as you know, the way Dr. Ahmed is back with us. Okay, Dr. Ahmed, I know, and I'm certain that, you know, a lot of scientific research on the subject of starvation has been done and has always been the case, conducted over a period of time. But what we are witnessing now is particularly looking at it in the medical field, where now questions are being raised. What does starvation do to the body? What does starving to death actually feel like? These are hard questions. How long does it take for a human body to die of starvation? And as you know, as a medical expert, and Ayesha alluded to breastfeeding week as well. And when one looks at the statistics, when one looks at the numbers, the babies, newborn babies, fetuses that have been killed in the wombs of their mothers as well, the amount of women that can't feed their children as well. And let's just try and put this into context against, you know, all these questions that are now being asked.
Yeah, look, this is a huge question. So the effects of starvation are both long-term and short-term, or short-term and long-term. The immediate effects are severe growth stunting, which is the obvious thing that you will see, where children will start losing weight, and they will also stop growing in terms of their height. So they'll have stunting of their height. Now, as far as the height problem is concerned, this is actually irreversible. So even if you, improve their nutrition, over time, they will still have growth stunting. The second important consequence of starvation or malnutrition in children is this impaired brain development and cognitive function. And as your earlier speaker had mentioned, that the first 1,000 days is extremely important in a child's life, particularly its brain development. And starvation during this window period actually causes irreversible damage. So you also get reduction in brain size and complexity. Malnutrition restricts the growth of neurons, the synapses and myelination of the brain, and therefore you get less complex neural networks. And this, in fact, can lead to lower IQ, cognitive defects, learning problems, memory problems, short attention span, difficulty in problem solving, and even abstract thinking. And many of these patients have delayed milestones. In other words, they don't reach their milestones in terms of sitting, walking, and talking, which is what happens with normal children. The other consequence of impaired nutrition in children is the immune system is weakened. So you get lots of nutritional deficiencies, particularly vitamins, which compromises the immune system. And then this predisposes these children to infections. And we know that there's no vaccinations occurring in Gaza at the moment. And there's been an outbreak of measles as well as meningitis. And lots of children have succumbed to measles and meningitis in Gaza because of a combination of lack of nutrition as well as lack of vaccination. The other kind of really serious side effects of malnutrition is organ damage and dysfunction. So organ damage can affect the heart, it can affect the liver, it can affect your digestive system, as well as your bones. You can get reduced bone density and then a risk of fractures. Malnutrition can also affect your metabolism and your endocrine system. But I think, and I can go on and on and on. There are behavioral effects, there are psychological effects. And of course, many of these children, because of their wasting and the weakened immune systems, are more prone to infections and therefore can succumb to the infection. But I think what's even more sinister is that when you have a malnourished child, and that child then has access to food. There's a condition, and I'm sure the dietitian is more familiar with this condition than I am. It's called refeeding syndrome, where if this child is not fed carefully and strategically and scientifically, they can have severe metabolic abnormalities, which can actually result in death. So refeeding syndrome, it's clinical complications that occur as a result of fluid and electrolyte balance during nutrition. And this occurs in patients who are malnourished. And what happens is, because of their malnutrition, they get fluid shifts, electrolyte shifts, and many other metabolic abnormalities. And if you feed them with the wrong food, and if you feed them too fast, you get refeeding syndrome, which actually has devastating consequences, and children can die from refeeding syndrome. So just giving them food is not good enough. You also got to give them the right type of food. You've got to give them the right amounts of food, and the timing has to be very, very careful. And there have to be a gradual introduction of feeds in these children so that you don't get refeeding syndrome. And the other very, very serious consequence of this is, and I don't think many people are aware of it, is that, starvation can also affect your gene expression. So it can actually change your genetic makeup. So even well-fed children of malnourished parents, they have very poor health outcomes. So it actually affects your genes. So the consequence of starvation, the consequence of kwashiorkor, of marasmus or malnutrition in children is not short-term, it's long-term. And what we're seeing now will affect generations to come. And that's the worrying part, and that's the dangerous part and the heartbreaking part.
Well, it certainly is very, very heartbreaking. Dr. Yumna, as the situation stands right now, the threat of death by starvation has spread from those who we thought were vulnerable at one point in time, but as things stand, to everybody in Gaza, each and every one, and that includes people like those that are helping out, aid workers, medical professionals. In fact, it spread right across the entire board. And a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity of talking to somebody from Doctors Without Borders, who was stationed in Gaza, who confirmed what we are saying here. But again, coming to this desperate environment that we're talking about, where starvation is now triggering this psychological torment, for want of a better term, and how that actually impacts on the body, that connection between the mind, the food for the brain, and the food for the stomach.
Definitely. So, starvation of the body also means starvation of the mind. In the same way that all of our organs are important and require nutrients and a stable supply of nutrients to function, our brains are pretty much the same. So our brains require glucose and the right amount of nutrients and a stable environment, or a stable source or supply of food in order to function. Not having that and not having that stable supply of nutrients leads to, firstly, what I'll talk about is cognitive dysfunction. And by that I mean that people who are starving, or people who aren't getting in enough calories or enough food, may struggle with higher order thinking, or using the more complex parts of their brains. For example, they may struggle to make important decisions or rational decisions. They may struggle with things like their problem-solving abilities, being able to regulate their emotions, being able to assess situations properly and make important decisions. And like you said, Inayat, this kind of starvation is not just affecting only the most vulnerable, but it's affecting across the board, basically everyone in Gaza. And we have to think about things like the aid workers, the doctors in the hospitals. All of them are experiencing the same level of starvation, and unfortunately are living under the cruel reality where even without food and even without a supply of food, they are still expected to do things like see patients, assist others, do surgeries, operations, have the health and the well-being of others in their hands. And as you can imagine, that puts them in a really difficult position, not having that regular supply of food, which is then affecting their ability to make decisions on behalf of themselves as well as decisions on behalf of others or the health and the welfare of others. We spoke a little bit earlier about the fear and anxiety that comes with that unpredictable or the unpredictability of a food source. And Ayesha mentioned, things about we've seen people getting shot waiting for food or waiting for aid in food queues. And I think we just have to kind of think around, we know that this is a life-saving basic human need that people require and that the people of Gaza require. And now that need and that basic requirement is now being associated with a threat to life. So, it's almost like making this really difficult choice. Do I want food for myself and my family to survive? I'm starving. I haven't had food for days. And do I want to take the risk of trying to find food and then possibly being killed or shot in the process? And you can kind of imagine these, the psychological dilemmas and the psychological conflicts that probably go through people's minds and the kind of stress that their minds are under and these difficult decisions that they have to make on a daily basis in Gaza.
Yes, Yumna, shukran for that. Ayesha, just in terms of nutrition and necessary nutrition, can one, under the circumstances, this is extreme in every sense of the word, can one make a distinction between adults, children, babies who are starving?
Define distinction. Can one make a distinction? As in, who do I choose? Do I look after myself or do I provide food for my child? Is that what you mean?
Well, that, and also in terms of starvation and its how it impacts on adults, children alike as well.
Versus children, yes. But I think as Dr. Manjra put it earlier, and mentioning refeeding syndrome was quite pertinent, because actually under the guidelines, if we had to treat babies with severe acute malnutrition, it's known as SAM to us. So you get moderate acute malnutrition and then you get severe acute malnutrition, which has very specific criteria, especially for babies. And how we would need to treat their needs is very particular. It's actually like titrated, like 20 and then adding 15 moles or 5 to 10 to 15 moles every time to prevent the refeeding syndrome that Dr. mentioned earlier. The consequences of which, if it's not done in the correct manner, would lead to renal failure, and it is prevalent on the body. So edema or swelling of the ankles and of the belly would occur. And this can occur in children as well as in adults. But I think for kids, it's so much more obvious because of their tiny stature, small bodies. And so they would deplete much faster. Whereas in adults, we have years of, muscle stores, fat stores that have been built up. And therefore, the body has a little bit more to sustain itself and therefore can survive for longer. SubhanAllah, it just sort of, if we take a step back and realize that our bodies have been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's so amazing in this way that even if we didn't have food for, from what we can see, a week, people are surviving more than a week without food, and children at that. But it just goes to show that we need to reflect on this more frequently. And in babies, sorry, I was mentioning earlier that when you treat malnutrition in babies, there's actually 10 steps that we take to treat that malnutrition. So it would go from a formula called F75 to then something called F100, where the ingredients of this is very particular. So them not even having these resources available to them, it baffles me how they're keeping the children alive even, and them being in the malnourished state themselves. So for adults especially, I think seeing the pictures of people skeletal images. There's a term that's used in cancer called cachexia, where you kind of can see the cheekbones and people's collarbones, and this is what we're seeing. So this is how it would present in an adult at the stage where the muscle and fat stores are now being used up, and nutrients being drawn even from the bones. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, it does. Well, Ayesha, in fact, and I know, when you say we need to reflect, you shared some thoughts with me before we actually came on air as well, and when we discussed the program as well. And I'd like you to share those thoughts with us in terms of reflection. But let's just get back to Dr. Ahmed Manjra. And Dr. Ahmed, with each passing day, with each month that is going, and as Ayesha speaks about the skeleton, and we're actually starting to see one image more horrific than the other image, where you're seeing a living skeleton, something that we would never have thought that we will see on a daily basis, because this is exactly what it has actually boiled down to, in the most horrific forms as well. And you were talking about generations and future generations, and we've seen what past generations in Palestine have gone through. And I painted that picture in my introduction in terms of the oceans of injustices that were systematic, whether it was economic strangulation, whether it was electricity, water deprivation, whatever it was. But with each passing month, with each passing day, we're seeing this taken to another level. And clearly, at some point in time, something has got to give, because this is now what no other generation has experienced ever before in Palestine.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think the frightening part for all of us as human beings, as humanity, is that this is deliberate. This is not a famine caused by some natural disaster. This is completely man-made. And superimposed on the starvation is the violence that these children are exposed to. It's one thing not having food, but it's another thing, seeing your parents being killed in front of you, your siblings being killed in front of you. And then they've got this term, there's an acronym for it, wounded child with no living parents. There's an acronym for that. And there are tens of thousands of these wounded children without limbs, with serious injuries, who don't have any living parents to take care of them. Who's going to look after this entire generation of children that are scarred, not only by nutrition, but also by violence? And, they don't have the love and the care and the affection that parents would normally give them. So the consequences of what we are seeing now will be seen for decades to come. It's not a short-term problem. It's going to be, and this is deliberate. This is what the Zionists want to do. They want to defeat the Palestinians, emotionally, physically, militarily, psychologically, in every possible way. And the biggest burden of what's happening are, unfortunately, the children of Palestine.
Certainly, Dr. Ahmed, and I think let's just ask, Dr. Yumna as well, just to comment on what you've just said in terms of the violence accompanied by, savagery, brutality, and at the same time, starvation as well. And I think that brings to the earlier point that you also made, Yumna, is, how can one actually be prepared to even treat a child or a human being who has gone through so much? And we always hear of the term closure. Now, these are people that haven't had closure at all. They may have their loved ones still buried under rubble, and they may never, ever get to see them. In fact, not very long ago, having covered the anniversary of the genocide that took place in Bosnia, where 30 years later, people were still finding bones. Some of them made 5 or 6 janaza salahs every time they found the bone of their loved one. And I'm sure there's thousands and thousands of those bones that are lying under heaps of rubble in Gaza as well.
I agree. I mean, I think I could talk for hours and hours about the levels of trauma and the types of trauma that children, men and women are suffering in Gaza. But, you know, like you said, we talk about traumatic incidences happening. And I suppose, you know, for us in our context, when we think about something like trauma, maybe we're thinking around, you know, like a hijacking or a burglary or, you know, something like that. It's this one singular event. We experience this trauma and then we take these steps to try and resolve our feelings and emotions around that. A process that we called processing the trauma. So, you know, we try to process the trauma. We try to, you know, go through and examine our feelings around it. And we try and move past that so that we can continue functioning normally in spite of the fact that we've been exposed to and we've had to experience this very difficult incident. If we look at what is happening in Gaza, you know, barely one incident happens and there's no time for closure, there's no time for processing anything, and the next event happens, and the next, and the next. And they are across the board different types of trauma. So as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's displacement, it's loss of family members, it's loss of homes and structures and infrastructure, it's starvation, it's witnessing brutality and violence and cruelty towards others, it's experiencing that for yourself. It's having to suffer injuries, it's losing limbs, and having to think about what the rest of your life is going to be like without an arm or a leg, to think about how you've lost your independence, how you're going to look after yourself. You mentioned the children. I mean, it's children who have lost an entire childhood and now have to grow up and worry about adult things that we find difficult, you know. Where do I get my next meal? I've got younger siblings to look after and I've got other family members to see and I'm maybe just barely, you know, 10, 11 years old. We've seen those things, we've seen those visuals, we've seen those videos. So, you know, it's one trauma after another. It is daily, excessive, consistent trauma. And we haven't even gotten to the point where we can say, right, this traumatic period has ended. Now let's work on resolving these emotions, these feelings. Like, let's process the trauma now. Let's, you know, work towards a resolution. Let's discuss the feelings around it. The people of Gaza don't have that luxury. They are literally in survival mode every single day. You know, they are just, I suppose, existing. If you wake up, I'm sure the kind of prevalent feeling is, do I die today? Do I die tomorrow? And these sound like very difficult realities. And yes, they're difficult for us to speak about. I think they're difficult to stomach. But we have to think about the fact that these are things that people are going through every single day.
And we need to continue talking about that. And Ayesha, I just want to bring you back to the point where you raise the issue about breastfeeding and challenges. Now, we all know it, that a mother and her baby are at their closest at that point when she is breastfeeding her baby. And I shudder to think what that mother or that baby is going through as she's holding her in the arms. And I mean, this is the reality. And if one can just draw that picture in the mind where she doesn't even have milk to actually feed her baby, I mean, just how heartbreaking, how that alone speaks volumes on its own.
Definitely. And it's, I am a new mother, going through the same challenges of starting to, well, my baby's now a year old, alhamdulillah. But even without those circumstances, it's a difficult experience. So I can't imagine what these moms are going through, especially considering that you need in excess of 500 extra kilocalories per day in order to feed the baby. So a mother's body is burning up those extra 500 kilocalories just to make the milk. And in this case, where they may be getting a quarter to half of their needs, if any, I can't imagine what they may be going through. There was a haunting image of a mom trying to feed her baby. This was like previously, towards like the beginning of when the conflict or the war started rather. And I remember that this mom was using gauze to try to feed the baby dates. And it struck me so hard to see that, this is, they're using whatever they have around them at that point in time. And it must be heartbreaking for the mother, because you definitely do internalize and think that this is my fault. I can't provide for my child. But in fact, she doesn't even have enough to provide for herself at that point. So for her to think about her baby is a huge mercy. And I can imagine a source of rahmah for her. That being said, if if aid was able to get in, and these mothers would then be able to feed themselves, even then, as Dr. Yumna mentioned, the psychological traumas that they've been through. To be able to breastfeed, you need to be in a calm state and environment because of what your body is trying to do. So even at that point, would they be able to? I would hope that they would, inshallah, and that the aid does get through somehow for the future generations of Gaza.
Yes, Dr. Ahmed, just adding to what Ayesha is saying, and perhaps you just like to comment and add to what Ayesha is saying, because I suppose, as a pediatrician as well, with all the experience that you've seen with regard to children, mothers as well, and I'm sure, a lot but to process. But again, this is a situation that is very, very extreme, and one can never be prepared to actually cope or deal with such an extreme situation, even medically.
Yeah, I think it's. I think the medical personnel in Gaza are heroes for what they are doing under dire circumstances. And as Ayesha have mentioned, that if the mothers who are breastfeeding are starving themselves, how are they going to have nutritionally adequate breast milk to feed the babies with? And that obviously has long-term consequences. We know that breastfeeding has huge benefits in terms of children's physical development, psychological development, emotional development, as well as intellectual development. And there have been lots of studies with regard to the benefits of breastfeeding. But these children obviously will be deprived of that because the mothers themselves are malnourished. They don't have food. Now, the acronym that I was talking about, it's called WCNSF. WCNSF stands for Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. And there are tens of thousands of these WCNSF children where they are wounded and they don't have any surviving families. And that's the tragedy of this whole thing, is that even if this genocide ends, and we can't call it a war because it's not two sides that are fighting, it's a genocide. It's a one-sided, fighting against unarmed people. Even when this genocide ends, the consequences of what we're seeing now will haunt generations of Palestinians to come. And the effects will last for a very, 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 very long time. And again, this is deliberate. This is not an accident. This is the Zionist mentality, and this is the Zionist plan to try and defeat the Palestinians through the weapon of food, starvation, and genocide.
Jazakallah. Dr. Yumna, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the children of Gaza. And we know that they are in a totally abnormal situation. They're not allowed to grow normally. They're not being fed. They're not allowed to go to school. They're not being educated. And one mustn't forget that the children of Gaza love their education. I know they've been, in fact, I recall just before the genocide, it was in July of 2023, where I interviewed a scholar, and she spoke about 90% of the students achieving more than 90%. And that was and subsequently I learned that she herself was actually martyred a few months later. So it became very, very personal for me as well, knowing somebody who was actually martyred. And just talking about the psychological development, and as Dr. Ahmed mentions, it's going to take years and years and years. And we know we can only rely on Allah as a source of comfort and to protect them and to make sure that they heal as quick as possible. But that healing process, mentally, psychologically, I mean, what is that going to take?
At the risk of sounding like your most pessimistic guest ever on the show, I mean, I agree. I think it's a huge, huge challenge, and this, even once we get to a point where we can say, right, this genocide has ended or the killing has ended, my worry, I suppose, is that we don't forget that the real work starts at that point. You mentioned the children, and I mean, this is an entire generation of children that have literally lost their early years. They've lost their childhoods. They've lost their parents. They've lost the stability of a home. Like you mentioned, they've lost their education. And we have to, I suppose, ask ourselves, what does that look like for these children 10, 15, 20 years from now? What kind of adults are they going to grow up to be, based on the fact that they've experienced the significant trauma and they've had like this lost childhood at this point in time? And, yes, we talk about this now, but like I said, my thought and my concern is always 20 years from now, we still need to be talking about this. We still need to be looking at what kind of help is needed at that point, or what kind of interventions are needed at that point. It shouldn't be that Allah willing, a genocide ends and then we don't think about the consequences thereafter and what happens to this entire generation of children that have been lost.
Yes, Aisha, in fact, I just want to talk about interventions because I think this is extremely important, and this is what you actually shared with me. And, taking your dietitian hat off and putting on your activist hat. And, you're talking about obviously continuing with the boycotting, spreading message, but also personal sacrifices that are required, particularly on indulgence. Because what Gaza has actually taught us, it's been a lesson for humanity. Really, since this genocide is unfolded, it's actually changed this entire world. And we see a lot of it on the ground as well. And there's a lot for us to internalize, to take in, and to take lessons from.
Absolutely, nice. And I think that you said take one hat on off and put the other one on, but they go hand in hand because it's such a stark contrast that the very brands that we indulge in are the ones that may be responsible for what's going on there. So boycotting the brands like Coca-Cola and McDonald's, which is such a sensitive topic for so many people. Even at this stage, it's hard for me to fathom that people still find it difficult to be boycotting. But I think that's the very least that we can do at this point, because if nothing else, if looking at these images and hearing about it is not stimulating a need in you to do something, we're not telling you do something. We're telling you take a step back and don't buy, don't go near it. There are so many alternatives. I'm not saying that it's easy to do so. We've become so used to these brands and the convenience of having certain things in our lives. But for having the lack of ability to do anything directly for them, aside from this, say even that you cannot donate towards the cause, take a step back and prevent yourself from needing or relying on certain brands and things that you could do without. Just look at the resilience of the Palestinian people, being able to do and live so much, as you said, that they love their education. The children are thriving despite not having the nutritional needs met. How are they thriving? Alhamdulillah, subhanallah. I think that we really need to take this into consideration and learn this lesson from them. My mom always says that if we were to be put in the same situation, we wouldn't last a day. And I think that she's correct about that. That had it been anyone else on this planet, how would they survive? How would they continue? So take a note and a message from the Palestinian people, from their resilience, and restrain yourself. Refrain from purchasing these brands. Spread the message far and wide as much as you can. Even without the ability to do anything else, it's the least that we can do to remember and empathize with their struggle.
Shukran for that, Ayesha. I see we've got about 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to just go around, starting with you, Dr. Ahmed, just some final thoughts.
I think I want to support what Sister Ayesha is saying. We sometimes feel helpless, but we're not helpless. There are lots of things that we can do. And I think two things we can definitely do. One is never stop talking about Gaza and Palestine. Keep on talking and don't get tired. Do not tire. The Palestinians have this whole concept of sumud, of resilience. We should never tire of talking about Palestine. Never give up. And make yourself heard, especially on social media. Use the social media platforms to expose the genocide and atrocities that are being perpetuated against the people of Palestine. Never tire and never give up. That's the first point I want to make. And the second point, BDS is very important. The boycott, diversification, and boycotting all these brands which support the genocide in Gaza. And there aren't that many. We need to make a concerted effort, and that's the least that we can do. So we must never feel helpless. There's a lot that we can do, and we need to have a clear strategy of never stopping to speak about the atrocities in Palestine, and we need to intensify our BDS campaign against all the brands that are supportive of the genocidal Zionist regime in Israel.
Jazakallah for that. Yes, Samud, I think, such an important word you mentioned, Dr. Ahmed. I recall Dr. Metz Gilbert, when we brought him over here to South Africa, mentioning that over and over again at all his engagements as well, the Samud and the resilience of the people of Palestine. Yumna, final thoughts?
I think that we all have to internalize that we bear some level of responsibility for what is happening to the people of Gaza and what is happening to the Palestinian people. We have, in as much as, we feel small, we have a sense of responsibility towards them, and our actions should reflect that, no matter how small the action may be. I hear people talking about how, they see things on social media and, it's so horrible to see this and so heartbreaking to see. And that's the thing, is that if we find it heartbreaking and if we find it difficult to look at, the one thing we should be doing is not looking away with a sense of inaction. So if we're seeing that and we feel that it's affecting us viscerally and on such a personal level, then we have to do something about it, even if it's just to relieve our own anxiety about what we see. There has to be some action that we follow through with when we see these things happening. And the very least of it, as Dr. Manjra said, is boycott and BDS.
Jazakallah. Ayesha, you can have the final word.
South Africans and everybody who is watching, please just start small. Buy one less Coke. Download the boycott apps. There are so many now. You can literally just Google it. You can make AI make you a list. There are local alternatives. You'd be proactive in supporting local brands and initiatives instead of supporting the ones that, as Dr. Manjra said, there are a few major ones and targeted brands that can make the most impact. Start small, one less thing. It's not going to harm you. And I think spreading the message as much as possible. Don't limit it to the Muslim community, but rather in your workspaces, in the marketplace, proverbial marketplace, social marketplace. Spread the word as much as possible in the ways that refer to you the most. So, wearing merchandise, speaking to people at their level about it as well. It's important to include kids in this narrative and teach them about gratitude and making dua, because we know that their duas are more likely to be accepted as well. And teaching them to empathize with the struggle from an early age, because as much as we would like to think it would end soon, it's been 67 years and running. The struggle is still going, and it's up to us to be loud about it if we want to see any change. So Bismillah, take a page from the book of the resilient Palestinian, and let's try and do one thing at least.
Inshallah. Well, Jazakallah khairan so much to all of you, really. And it's been an absolute pleasure, really. And I must say that, from what we've seen from a media perspective at Salam Media, and, we've been, alhamdulillah, relentless in our coverage of this genocide. And since we've embraced the principle of humanitarian journalism, is engaging with a cross-section of people and the healthcare workers, for Paelstine as well, right at the forefront as well, and always, very supportive of the work that we're doing. And it's, again, it's combining our efforts, whether it's media, whether it's the healthcare, whether we're talking about activists, PDS, whatever we're talking about, at the end of the day, and like you mentioned, Ayesha, as well, is to embrace that diversity as well. So inshallah, we're looking forward to that, and also to remind our viewers and listeners this evening that we have got a campaign coming up. Ali Abu Nima, Director of Electronic Intifada, and a young journalist, 22 years old, out of Gaza, Abu Bakr Abid, who will be coming through to South Africa towards the end of August. So we will be we're featuring them in most of the major cities with certain events, inshallah. So just to inform our listeners and viewers to please look out for that. Some of the information is already gone out, but we will keep you informed with a lot more. Once again, Yumna Minty, Ayesha Madaran, and Dr. Ahmed Manjra, Jazakallah khairan so much for your time. We do appreciate you taking time out with us on Salam Media. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of In Conversation with myself, Inayat Wali, right here on Salam Media. And once again, focusing on the dire situation as far as the starvation that is now being used as a weapon of war. And the point that we made very, very early, one of the most undignified and barbaric ways to kill a fellow human being, and that is starving him of much needed nutrition in his body. And with that, I'm signing off until we meet again. From myself and the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.